you go to Libya recently?
I haven't been since the end of the revolution. No, I did 8 months in Libya, but I haven't been since. No. Might go next few weeks. Mr. Arthur particularly. It's interesting. It's interesting because of the migrant story more than what's going on in Libya, because what's going on in Libya is just nuts. Yeah. I'd like to go back into Syria, but the boss won't let us at the moment. And then I was going a lot with Jabhat al-Nusra, who were at that point great, but I'm not sure we trust them anymore. I'm not sure who we trust anymore.
You will never know.
To be honest, the day that Jim Foley got taken, he was in a town called Binish, and on that very same day, he was going out of Syria and got snatched. I was going in with Cappon, and I was with Jabhat al-Nusra, so yeah. Shall we start?
Yeah. Buongiorno, iniziamo. Questo panel sarà in inglese, quindi non c'è la traduzione. Okay. Good morning, my name is Laura Cappon, and since 2011 I'm a Cairo-based journalist reporting for several Italian radio stations and newspapers. We are here today to talk about the Free Al Jazeera staff campaign. At the end of 2013, Peter Grest, Mohammed Fahmy, and Baher Mohammed of Al Jazeera were arrested in Egypt on charge of spreading false information and supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, the political group considered to be a terrorist organization by the government of Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. Al Jazeera launched an online mobilization using the Free Al Jazeera staff hashtag to make international public opinion aware of the issue and to put pressure on the Cairo authorities, a sort of massive flash mob on social media, in the words of the webpage dedicated to the initiative, which reached about 3 million people. On June 2014, Grest and Fahmy were sentenced to 7 years in prison, while Mohammed received an additional 3 years for having a spent bullet in his possession, which he had picked up at the protest site. The other defendants were sentenced in absentia to 10 years. But on January the 1st, 2015, the Court of Cassation accepted the appeal of the 3 Al Jazeera journalists and ordered a retrial. The trio, after more than 400 days of imprisonment, were released. The trial is still going on. Peter Grest was deported in Australia at the beginning of this year, while Mohammed Fahmy and Baher Mohammed are still in Egypt. Today, we have with us Sue Turton, who played a central role in the campaign. Sue is an Al Jazeera journalist since 2010, and along with her colleagues in the same trial, she was tried in absentia for hiding and abetting a terrorist organization in Egypt. Good morning, Sue.
Good morning.
It's a pleasure to have you here with us. Could you please tell us how was this campaign born, if you were expecting this huge response around the world?
Okay. Is it better that I speak like normally, like this, or through the microphone? Because it's a bit echoey, isn't it? Can everybody hear me if I speak like this? Best for the microphone. All right. Try not to echo if possible. This media campaign has been described by many as the most successful ever when it comes to journalism. The global reach was extraordinary for a number of reasons. Other incarcerated journalists, snatched journalists have had campaigns mounted for them, thinking of people like McCarthy and Keenan and around the world, but nothing really galvanized the media like the Free AJ staff campaign. And I suspect some of you here actually joined it, whether you tweeted or even turned up at a demo. So first of all, thank you for joining. But also I suspect some of you might not even really know the story behind how the incarcerations came about. So I'll quickly run through, if I can, what happened to us and then how we indeed did mount the campaign. Cast your minds back to 2013 and when there was the coup in Egypt. And the press crackdown was horrendous. You might remember that a Sky News cameraman called Mick Dean was shot while he was covering the demonstrations there by a government sniper and killed. Many other journalists were rounded up at the time. It was very, very difficult trying to report on the streets of Cairo and across Egypt because of the intimidation. Really, the government didn't want any other story but their own narrative of what was going on in Egypt. And that wasn't just the international journalists, the local journalists were targeted as well. And not even the journos. I don't know if you know of a guy called Bassem Youssef, who was kind of Egypt's answer to Jon Stewart. He was taken off air because he was satirizing lots of people in Egypt, including Sisi and the government, and has had to leave the country since then. Satire is not accepted by the Egyptian authorities, as well as independent journalism. And we were covering everything, really. I mean, 24-hour news can actually be quite a grind. We were doing pollution stories and football stories, as well as, of course, there's sort of the politics and the protests at the same time. Just going to play you a couple of reports, one from me and one from Peter Grester, who obviously ended up being imprisoned for 400 days. So this one from me.
On the streets of Cairo, young and old, Muslim Brotherhood, anti-coup, wealthy and not so wealthy, protesting against the government. The original plan, to march to Tahrir Square, abandoned to stop further violence. Even Rabah Square, where hundreds were killed 2 months ago, was a no-go area. Egypt has been in crisis for the past 100 days, after hundreds of thousands demonstrated against the elected president's rule of law. His former defense minister was ready to capitalize on the growing unrest.
I ask that next Friday all honest and trustworthy Egyptians must come out. But why come out? They come out to give me the mandate and order that I confront violence and potential terrorism.
On July the 3rd, the military removed Morsi from office, provoking the Muslim Brotherhood to take to the streets as its leaders were rounded up. But what happened next divided the country further. A crackdown on Brotherhood sit-ins killed over 1,000 in violence that horrified Egyptians.
When he began to kill people and began in this coup, we are all unified against this because there is no justice. We are talking about justice.
On October the 6th, the anniversary of the 1973 war with Israel, this division was clear to see. In Tahrir Square, supporters of the new government out on the streets, protests against the coup. Another 57 are killed.
The President was also clear and has been clear that we are not able to continue with business as usual. And as you know, we have already announced that we are not proceeding with the delivery of certain military systems. Following on the results of the review directed by President Obama, we will announce the future of our assistance relationship with Egypt once we have made the appropriate diplomatic and congressional notifications.
US President Barack Obama had questioned Morsi's democratic principles, but his successors were doing no better. There was little interest in any American pressure on Friday, but many calls for justice for those killed in the protests.
We are not listening to the Americans cutting aid. What matters to us, and the important thing, is the opinion of the Egyptian people.
Morsi will go on trial for those killed outside the presidential palace. But what about those who were killed in Rabah? We should start looking for those killers.
The anti-coup alliance is desperate to keep these protests going, but the security forces are trying to strangle that momentum, cutting off their routes, stopping them going into the various squares around Cairo. And they're also facing the majority of Egyptian people that are too scared or just not interested in joining their protests.
Across town, life goes on. The silent majority might not approve of those in power, but to them, the time has passed for further unrest. Now they just want to get the country back on its feet. Sue Turton, Al Jazeera, Cairo.
So that one was in October 2013, and the second one is Peter Grester, 25th of December, Christmas Day, just 4 days before he was arrested.
After the blast came the anger. Enraged demonstrators marched through the streets in Mansoura in solidarity with the security services targeted in the bombing. They set fire to vehicles belonging to members of the Muslim Brotherhood after someone waved the movement's four-fingered salute.
I accuse the Brotherhood and anyone who is collaborating with them. They are terrorists. The Brotherhood group, I want to kill them and anyone working with them, whether inside or outside Egypt. It's the people's judgment. All the people want this terrorist group exterminated.
At the city's main hospital, those caught in the explosion struggled to make sense of it.
While I was doing my work, I hit the wall, then hit the table, and back to the wall again. I tried to stand up, but then I fell. I felt as if I couldn't breathe, like someone coming out of a river of blood.
The Interior Minister went to the hospital where he condemned the attack. He said it was an attempt to derail next month's referendum on a new constitution, but he insisted it will go ahead.
The security plans have been made, and what happened will not affect the referendum process because it has its own comprehensive security plan.
The car bomb hit the security service's main headquarters in Mansoura soon after midnight. Among the casualties, a group of senior security officials meeting to discuss how they'll keep control of the referendum. The Muslim Brotherhood has been the target of public anger here, but it has condemned the attack, while the radical militant group Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis said it was responsible. For the angry crowds, though, there is no distinction. At a funeral for some of the 14 people killed in the blast, mourners continued to blame the Brotherhood and its supporters. If the attackers were hoping to deepen the political divisions in Egypt, it seems to have worked. Peter Grester, Al Jazeera, Cairo.
So, as I say, 4 days after Peter made that report, the security services came through his hotel room door, and where Mohammed Fahmy, who was working in the suite that we were using as an office, they posed as somebody delivering some room service as he looked through the spy hole in the door. And then as soon as he opened the door, almost a dozen security guys came rushing in, and they were arrested. A lot of people have questioned whether Al Jazeera should have pulled us all out. And I'd already left. I left in November, but we still had a full team there. There's questions as to whether they were negligent for leaving the journalists in the country when obviously the press crackdown was really pushing a lot of people to decide to go to the airport and leave. My reaction to that, I suppose, and I wonder if you all sit here thinking, well, would I wanted to stay in Cairo when this was obviously becoming so stressful for journalists? I worked in and out of countries for many years for Al Jazeera. In Libya, the government weren't exactly enamored by the Al Jazeera team covering events there. In fact, at one point there was $1 million bounty on our heads. In Syria, in and out of Syria, Bashar al-Assad blames Al Jazeera for the whole Arab uprising. So if he'd managed to catch one of the journalists, we would have been incarcerated for sure. In a way, Egypt was different because we were in the same place that the government was. We were in Cairo. But I would suggest that the finest hour of Al Jazeera was actually the day that President Mubarak stepped down. That moment when the announcement was made in Tahrir Square, the presenter who was sitting in the anchor chair at Al Jazeera English did something very unusual for a journalist. He shut up. He basically let the pictures just run for 9 minutes. And the wave of euphoria that went across Tahrir Square, and as the realization that this revolution that had killed so many people had been successful, and the president had decided to step down. A lot of the time, Al Jazeera had stayed on air during that revolution, much to their own fears, and because they were being hounded at that time as well by the government. They tried to jam our signal, and we had to keep switching signals so people could keep watching. So, there had been a great risk to journalists at that time. I know one cameraman, big burly Egyptian, a guy who works for us, was threatened with a machete. They tried to bundle him into a taxi. He carried on working. So, you go forward a couple of years, and for us to just sort of put down our pens and our cameras and headed for the airport was almost just doing them a disservice. They'd stuck it out, so should we. Obviously, we weren't aware at the time that we were kind of marked by the government. And we also, to be honest, weren't aware that the relation between Egypt and Qatar had got so bad. So, there we are, sitting in Doha. We hear our 3 guys have been arrested. And we're thinking, what should we do? Should we stay quiet in the hope that they're released fairly swiftly? And during the months before, there'd been a lot of journalists who had been arrested and who had eventually been either deported or released. So we kind of decided that we'd just stay quiet for a while. You know, we don't want to back the authorities into a corner, make a noise, and they'd have to admit they'd made a mistake by arresting 3 journalists. But of course, days turned into weeks, and it was clear that this wasn't going to be resolved quickly. And then later in January, a month later after the arrests, they released the charge sheet. And on this charge sheet were obviously the 3 guys in prison, but there were another 6 of us from Al Jazeera who were being charged at that point in absentia, myself being one of them. So we looked at this charge sheet, and obviously the rest of the media went mad and said, you know, is this you? Is this your middle name? Is this your passport number? And eventually we had to say, yeah, these names are us. We've no idea why they picked us, but they did. And then the coming weeks, we were like, okay, what happens next? And at that point, we just decided maybe we need to start making some noise, because this isn't going to go away. And we came up with all sorts of crazy ideas. One person said, why don't we beam the 3 guys in prison's faces on the pyramids, you know, and scream for their release? Thankfully, we decided against that one. But it was Peter's colleagues in Kenya that came up with this image. These guys had been working, obviously, alongside Peter for a long time and liked him very much and were very concerned. And they came up with this genius idea. First idea was to put the Egyptian flag over the mouth as very symbolic. Egypt's silenced these 3 journalists, which was great. We were all blown away by that idea. But then we kind of moved it on and simplified it, I suppose. And I went around the Al Jazeera headquarters and basically harassed everybody to go and have their picture taken. And the image that obviously went viral eventually was covering the mouth, holding up the sign, as simple as it could possibly be. And it was very effective. It sort of galvanized, I suppose, people's imaginations a little bit. Yeah. So that was our sort of visual reaction to what was happening. Obviously, behind the scenes, there's an awful lot going on. We were calling absolutely everybody that we could think of, whether being in the diplomacy or in politics or in the media, to try and get everybody behind why these guys should be released. And there was nothing suspicious about our team. They were doing a straightforward job. Get involved. And, you know, as journalists, we all have sort of contacts, and one of them was this lady here. And when Christiane got involved, and she wouldn't cover her face with the tape, you know, hey, didn't want to upset the lipstick, I guess, but hey, lots of us don't want to be shut up. But she did hold the sign up, and I mean, thankfully, her program editor is a very old colleague of mine from Channel 4 News, and he sort of pushed her, but she was very supportive, as were CNN and the whole. In fact, CNN probably did more than anybody else for us. They even gave us a journalist during the trial to report for Al Jazeera, which, if you think they are our biggest competitor, is extraordinary for another channel to do that for us. So lots of people got involved. The Frontline Club in the UK were contacted by the Egyptian ambassador, who was very concerned about these images and wanted to talk to journalists in the UK. So Vaughan, who runs the Frontline, got lots of journalists together and called me and said, you know, what should we make sure we put to him? And I said, well, I'm actually in London on that day. Shall I come? And I said, oh, well, that, you know, backfire. And he went, you know what, this is your club as well. Come. So there we are sitting around the table for this meeting. And it was off the record, so I can't tell you everything that was said. But I would say that all those around the table wrote a letter that was to be handed to the Egyptian Foreign Secretary to say, this is outrageous, we stand behind Al Jazeera. And one other little anecdote, Jon Snow from Channel 4 News at one point, when the Egyptian ambassador said, yes, but they didn't have accreditation, they should never have been working there. He stood up, proffered his wrists to the Egyptian ambassador and said, Mr. Ambassador, you should arrest me and take me to prison. I also was in Egypt last year without accreditation. Which the ambassador quickly coughed and sort of moved on and said that wasn't the point after all. But there was lots of positivity at that point. Everybody seemed to be saying, look, this is never going to last long. They must recognize these charges against you. These terrorism charges, which is what we were accused of, will go away. But of course they didn't, and we ended up in a trial. And can you imagine seeing your colleagues who you work with looking like this? Shocking, not shocking to probably Egyptians, because this is how they treat people who are accused, including President Mubarak. But for us to see the three guys that, you know, I worked alongside for months, to be incarcerated like this and treated like terrorists. When they were arrested, they were put in a maximum security unit. This was as harsh as it can get. They were sleeping on a stone floor with, you know, no blankets, very cold in January. And conditions to start with were extremely harsh for them. They really were being treated as terrorists. So there we were, the trial, and I'm sure a lot of you followed the trial. The evidence, Amnesty called the trial a sham, and the evidence that they used was mostly off Peter's hard drive. Everybody that's got a hard drive knows that, you know, you put all sorts of stuff on it. And for Peter, there was holiday pictures. There was some sort of download of horses from Sky Arabia. Not sure what he was doing with that. There was one of his documentaries he won an award for when he worked for the BBC, which was shown in court. And I think all the journalists that turned up to the trial were expecting some smoking gun. I think they were expecting that the Egyptian authorities had some amazing evidence against us. And it did turn into a bit of a farce. But what that did was it made us all think there's no way we'll be found guilty. And then the worst happened, and we were. And the shock reverberated around our colleagues all over the world. Just before the trial, I'll just play you one video that Orla Guerin from the BBC put together. This includes the video, which again, I'm guessing a lot of you have seen, of the arrest of the guys. When you think, are you going to get a fair trial? If this goes out on national television, then it's not really a fair trial that's going to happen.
A grainy video with a sinister soundtrack. This footage shows the raid on Al Jazeera's hotel room in late December. It's been broadcast on national TV. There's a glimpse of Peter Gresta.
Then find someone who can interpret from you.
Then the interrogation begins. His producer, Mohammed Fahmy, trying to explain they were just doing their jobs. But with their colleague, Beher Mohammed, in the centre, they've been branded the Marriott terror cell and accused of aiding the now banned Muslim Brotherhood. Al Jazeera is owned by the government of Qatar, which backs the Brotherhood, but the channel denies allegations of bias. Egypt says its journalists broke the law by working without press passes.
Seeing him in those prison whites was a shock, yeah.
Peter Gresta's brother, Andrew, has just visited him in jail. He's travelled from Australia to support him at the trial. He says the charges are ludicrous.
If it wasn't so serious, it'd be laughable, because he's a veteran journalist of more than 25 years. He's award-winning. He prides himself on his high journalistic credentials.
But Peter and his team are now inmates in the Torah prison complex, a fortress with a reputation for brutality. Well, we can't film openly here because of the security presence in the area. We know that behind these walls, the three men are now sharing a cell. They're being allowed out to exercise for only an hour a day. Many believe that their imprisonment is a message to all journalists in Egypt. If you don't stick to the government line, you can wind up behind bars. Abdullah El-Shami has been held for 6 months without charge. The reporter with Al Jazeera's Arabic channel is now on hunger strike. His brother Musab is a photographer who says journalists are living in fear. His images captured the hope of the revolution and the return of repression. Lately, he's taking fewer pictures because of the risk of being jailed.
It is my biggest fear, to be arrested, because I know that it's going to take months, if not years, before going out. And we've seen how journalists in Egypt have been detained for the most absurd reasons, and they continue to spend their, months of their lives. And a day in prison is really like no other day.
Peter Gresta and his colleagues now face a day in court. He says their only offence here was to cover all sides of the story. Critics say in today's Egypt, that's tantamount to a crime. Orla Guerin, BBC News, Cairo.
So I'll just show you one of the video while I keep talking. What happened, I suppose, after the verdict was why the campaign ended up being quite so extraordinary, because every news channel, every news channel around the world pretty much either did an interview with me or an interview with one of my colleagues in Al Jazeera, got involved in the Global Day of Action, just extraordinary support that we couldn't have asked for or begged for. And, sorts of videos. This is the guys from ITN put this one together. Really just trying to show to Egypt that this wasn't about Al Jazeera. It was about journalism. And it was about protecting your colleagues if the worst happens. Same went for the BBC. Everybody getting on board, really, and the Twitter sphere reacted. We went global, but even at that point, we I suppose were hoping that Egypt would recognise the mistake. But of course, again, the verdict happened, and that was last summer, and the guy stayed in incarceration all the way until Christmas. So we already discussed that, that they are now out of jail, but on retrial. All three of them, Peter's been deported, he's in Australia. Baha, Mohammed and Mohammed Fahmy are still stuck in Egypt. Mohammed Fahmy's tried to get deported to Canada. He renounced his own citizenship of Egypt because he's dual passport. But at the moment, the Canadians haven't been successful. And he and Baha have to report to the police station every day. And in 4 days' time, another session of the retrial will be held. The judge has ordered a technical committee to relook at the evidence. He's going through the motions. We hope that the retrial will acquit the guys. There are still forces in Egypt that still think Al Jazeera should pay for what they believe as falsifying news. Just one final word on the absentees, including myself. We're still convicted of terrorism. Charges against me still stand, and I'm not being retried. Unless I go to Egypt and hand myself in, that is not going to happen. That's now a consideration that the lawyers are discussing, which, I have to say, I'm not sure that they're going to persuade me. But if I don't go, then I will have a conviction for terrorism on my head for the rest of my life, which obviously has an impact on countries I can travel to. So the last note is that our campaign continues until we're all cleared. This still hangs over our heads, and we're going to have to keep fighting. And it's a trial to try and keep momentum and people interested in the campaign at this stage, because they're not still behind bars. And my very final point is, we've kind of shown with this campaign how much energy and support you can really galvanize when you try, because our profession is amazing in that regard. People really did come through for us. And there are many people around the world, not just guys in Egypt, although there are quite a lot of journalists still in Egypt incarcerated, that we should think about and try to make some noise, because as a unit, as a whole, when we campaign together, it really has made a difference for us, and I'm sure could make a difference to those guys. Guys out there that are incarcerated that don't have huge channels to mobilize. Maybe they're freelancers, people that don't have any backing. We should think about and maybe try and engage ourselves to making some noise on their behalf.
Yes, and how has this campaign affected the developments of the trial for you, if it did something?
Has it affected the what?
The trial, like the authorities, what do you think?
Some people have said, was it successful? And I suppose when I look at it, they still were in jail for 400 days or more. So I could say, no, we weren't successful. They went through so long incarcerated that, hand on heart, I kind of think if we were going to be successful, we would have got them out earlier. But in the end, keeping the spotlight on them meant they did get out eventually. And I do think that if there wasn't this noise, they might still be in prison, and they may not have even had a trial. Because there's an awful lot of people in prison in Egypt right now who haven't even been shown their charges, never mind taken to court.
Yes, and Sisi said that he could issue a pardon once the trial will end. What do you think?
He has said that. In a way, a pardon for what, I suppose, is our reaction. As far as we're concerned, we didn't do anything wrong. But yeah, I'll take the pardon if that's all I'm offered. But I'm not sure we can trust that will happen. We've relied on the Egyptian judicial system to do the right thing now for over a year, and it hasn't. So, yeah, the pardon, if it comes, fantastic, but I wouldn't put my mortgage on it.
Okay, the last question for me, then I will let the public ask something to you. It's if you have what is the role that the public opinion has to play, for the security of the journalists? Because this campaign shows that public opinion can keep the attention.
Our profession is not always that popular. Some people put us sort of almost below estate agents and lawyers. But I think the message we always tried to get across was, if you shut a journalist up, if you silence a journalist, those are the eyes and ears of the people that watch their channel or they read their newspaper. That's the reason we're out there. When I go into Syria and risk my neck, it's not because I want to get shot at. It's because I think what's going on in Syria is important, and people need to know that dreadful atrocities are going on. And there is no camera there. There is nobody writing or taking pictures. So in the end, the only thing we really have is public support and each other for when the worst happens. If somebody is incarcerated, if somebody is intimidated or snatched, then the only way to really hope that they can get released is if we all make noise about it. Our colleagues, as I say, but also the public, and the public with our hashtag campaign, really recognise that it's important. Journalism is important, and they came right. They did come through for us. We went viral with that campaign, I think, 5 times.
Thank you. So we have still 15 minutes. If there is any question. Sì, si sta arrivando.
I work for Reportedly, and we follow the campaign very closely. I've been personally following Egypt since 2011. If you follow the story very closely, there were gaps in the story. And I would like to hear your take on it, as much as you can say about it, because I know that being still a defendant in the trial, it's very complex to talk about these issues. The first gap was there was no attention whatsoever when in 2013, Al Jazeera massacre was shut down. And Egyptian journalists were persecuted. There was not a whiff of wind about it, which still worries me to this day, because as you said, that's the moment when everything happened. That's the moment where you guys were marked. That's the moment where Rabah happened. That was a turning point. And I would like to hear your opinion about it. And this is connected to the behavior of Al Jazeera, the TV station. Did you feel supported the whole time? Mohammed Fahmy has underlined a lot of times that he didn't enjoy the kind of defense that he would have liked to have, so he approached a different kind of... and if at the end of the day, legally having individual choices for each of the defendants in terms of legal assistance could damage them. I'm thinking of next campaigns, and I'm thinking this could happen to somebody else. Are these gaps damaging for the end result of getting these people free and other journalists freed in Egypt?
I think that the Al Jazeera and Mubashir Misra is a very important part of what did happen for sure. In the end, Al Jazeera has this local TV station. Al Jazeera Live is basically what Al Jazeera and Mubashir Misra is in Egypt, the domestic channel. And they were, I would say, a little bit like Al Jazeera Arabic. You know, they take a point of view, and this point of view was not welcomed by the Egyptian government. And they were shut down, and they were no longer operating inside of Cairo, although they were still broadcasting, as were obviously Al Jazeera Arabic. And I definitely think that we were rounded up and imprisoned as the Al Jazeera network employees, not Al Jazeera English. At no point during the trial have they ever come anywhere close to sort of proving that we falsified any news. And we were all waiting for our reports to appear on screen and for some sort of proof, but there was none of that. I think what basically happened was they rounded up our journalist as Al Jazeera. And that was pretty clear in the courtroom, because one of the so-called experts that was brought in to talk about how we falsified news was asked, do you know the difference between Al Jazeera Arabic, Mubashir Misra, and Al Jazeera English? And he had no clue, no idea. So, you know, we were tried as representatives of the whole network, nothing really to do with our work on screen. And yes, Mubashir Misra was shut down as part of the whole press crackdown. Al Jazeera Arabic was the most watched Arabic news station in the whole of the Middle East. And it was still broadcasting, you know, right across Egypt. And it was the only channel at the time that was offering any alternative viewpoint. So they had to silence it. They had to shut it down. And it's like Orla mentioned in her report for the BBC, you know, a lot of what's gone on isn't just about shutting up Al Jazeera, it's intimidating and forcing many other foreign correspondents to self-censor. You know, I know a lot of journalists who worked in Egypt after that were too scared to interview Muslim Brotherhood. They were too scared to go and talk to Anti-Coup Alliance because they could end up where our boys ended up. So it worked. You know, CNN closed their own bureau down there. You know, enough. It was too much of a risk. So, I mean, definitely the Mubashir Misra had an impact. I've forgotten what your second point was. Oh, the legal side of it.
Sorry, I had a problem about a difference in defense.
No, for sure. I mean, you know, I covered a lot of sort of British court cases. You know, I was in and out of the Old Bailey for many years and the High Court in London, and I know how the British legal system would treat something like this. But the Egyptian legal system is very different. And also, Al Jazeera on the streets was very unpopular to a lot of people. And so getting a lawyer to represent us in Cairo was very difficult. You know, these guys were really taking a risk if they would stand up in court and act on our behalf. So we were already in a very challenging environment. And the one thing the Egyptian ambassador said to me when we met at that frontline club was, oh, you'll be fine if you have a good lawyer. It was just like, yeah, but how do we get a good lawyer to stand up for us when they are being intimidated themselves in Egypt? So, yeah, it was very difficult. And the lawyer that we did have during the court case, in the end, actually turned against us. Now, why did he do that? I have no clue. I don't know whether he did feel strongly that Al Jazeera behaved badly or whether somebody just got to him. I have no clue. Mohammed Fahmy got his own lawyer, which Al Jazeera paid for, yes, and he actually worked out being a very good lawyer. So, you know, yeah, maybe it would have been better if everybody had their own lawyers. I suppose, again, this is a cultural thing, but for Al Jazeera, they're an Arabic channel. They think, you know, the legal department should represent everybody. It's not something that if you work for the BBC in London, you'd accept. You'd say, no, we need our own brief. we're dealing with a very different environment here. And the one thing you get used to when you're working in somewhere like the Middle East and you're working for an Arab channel is things are different. And you can fight against it, but quite often you're not going to be successful. So in the end, didn't work out for us. I do question whoever we'd got as lawyers, whether the verdict would have been any different in that first trial. No questions?
No question? Okay.
There was, Al Jazeera was targeted in a similar case in China. So a completely different environment. The correspondent of Al Jazeera English in Beijing, Melissa Chen, was kicked off the country. Yep. I guess it was 2012. So we're talking about two nations which couldn't be more different. I mean, China and Egypt. The only similarity is that probably, of course, we're talking about regimes. And Al Jazeera was at the center of similar cases in both countries. So my question is, do you see a pattern? There's something in Al Jazeera English's method that somehow bothers the sort of regimes?
Yeah, I know Melissa Chan very well. And if memory serves me right, she was doing a report about prison conditions, was one of the reasons. If the pattern is that we are doing stories that upset the authorities, then yes, I probably accept that as the case. We have bureaus right across the world, and the tagline for Al Jazeera is the voice of the voiceless, which is a bit trite, but you know what, it's true. I've heard it quoted that we don't sort of interview the captain of industry. We might have a chat with him, but we'll talk to his driver, because his driver probably tells you what's really going on. And that gets under the skin of the authorities, it gets under the skin of governments. And I mean, I played a couple of reports there from Peter and I from Egypt. They weren't biased. They tried to show both sides. They tried to be straight down the line in difficult circumstances. Same with Melissa. That's what she was trying to do in Beijing. So, yeah, there's probably a pattern in that we're making noise when we're possibly upsetting the authorities where other journalists aren't and possibly aren't doing similar stories. But I don't think that's a bad thing, I mean, that's what we're for. We're not there to sort of follow the narrative of the people in charge. We're there to question it and challenge it. And if somebody is being treated badly or abused, then that's why Al Jazeera was set up, really, to try and go into these places and shine a light and give people some oxygen and publicity so that their voices are heard.
Okay. Last question is mine, and we will. So, how Al Jazeera is working now in Egypt? Which kind of strategies are taking to...
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say that nobody is in Egypt for Al Jazeera at the moment. In fact, my boss said to me the other day, we are going to have to open the bureau again eventually. And I said, okay, which journalist or which correspondent's going to volunteer for that gig? None of us. So it's a great empty chasm, really. Egypt is an incredibly big player in the Middle East, especially with developments with ISIL and what's going on in Yemen at the moment. They're very much part of it, and we're trying to tell the whole story. And it's very difficult doing that remotely from outside the country. So, yeah, we're at the moment, we can't even think about going back in there. We do still have staff who are based there, but they can't work. So, yeah, I suppose the answer to it is, well, we're not. And, I mean, I've said this so many times. I've done over 440 interviews on this campaign over the last year, and I've given a lot of speeches. And, I've said many, many times that if Egypt is going to be this amazing country that we know it can be, if it's going to be recognized as one of the strongest countries in that area, in that region, then this idea of a roadmap to democracy, which they talked about straight after the revolution, you know, they have to get back on track with it, and that means the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press. At the moment, their economy is not great, and their tourism industry is flatlining, has been for quite some time, because people aren't confident about going back. And, you know, the sort of message we've had over the last year is, if you show by releasing the journalists, by embracing the opposition, we all know what's going on with the Muslim Brotherhood supporters who've been rounded up and imprisoned. If you show the world that you are willing to hear an opposing viewpoint, maybe the tourists will get back on the plane and, you know, the pyramids will be full again.
So thank you very much for being here. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Where are you heading to next?
I'm going to Cairo again.
Are you?
Yeah, I'm leaving now in 2 hours.
How is it for you when you're working there? Huh? How is it working there at the moment?